To understand how the United States weaponized the dollar against Iran, it's essential to grasp both the geopolitical context and the economic landscape. After the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the U.S.-Iran relationship changed overnight. The overthrow of the Shah and the establishment of the Islamic Republic marked a seismic shift in Middle Eastern politics. Washington, which had relied on Iran as a regional ally and oil supplier, suddenly faced a hostile state that rejected its influence. This conflict was not only political or military, it was also financial, and here the dollar became a weapon of extraordinary power. At the time, the global financial system was heavily dollarized. Oil trade, the backbone of the Iranian economy, was conducted almost exclusively in U.S. dollars through the petrodollar system established in the 1970s. This system tied global oil sales to the dollar, giving the United States unprecedented leverage over any nation that depended on oil exports or imports. Iran, despite its vast oil reserves, was immediately vulnerable. The dollar's centrality in international trade meant that access to this currency was not optional, it was essential for survival in the global market. In the early 1980s, the U.S. moved to exploit this dependency. Washington understood that direct military confrontation carried high risks and costs. Economic pressure, on the other hand, could achieve strategic objectives without firing a shot. The dollar became a tool of coercion. By restricting Iran's access to international banking, loans and trade denominated in dollars, the U.S. could isolate the country financially while maintaining a veneer of legality through sanctions and regulatory frameworks. One of the first measures involved curtailing Iran's access to correspondent banking. Most international banks rely on U.S.-based institutions to clear dollar transactions. By threatening penalties, revoking licenses, and restricting dollar transfers, the U.S. effectively cut off Iranian banks from the global financial system. Transactions that were routine for other countries became nearly impossible for Iran. This tactic created cascading effects. Companies that might otherwise sell machinery, technology, or industrial inputs to Iran faced either extreme difficulty or legal repercussions. Even allies of Iran were pressured to comply. Dollar dominance made non-compliance risky, forcing a broader international squeeze. The consequences for Iran were immediate and severe. With limited access to dollars, the country struggled to fund imports critical for industrial production. Machinery for oil extraction, spare parts for refining, and essential medical supplies all became hard to acquire. The government was forced to rely on barter or alternative currencies, which were less efficient and more vulnerable to market fluctuations. This disruption extended beyond economics. It undermined state capacity, weakened the domestic economy, and eroded public confidence in the government's ability to maintain stability. Beyond direct sanctions, the U.S. also used the dollar to influence international oil markets in ways that compounded pressure. By coordinating with allies, Washington could encourage oil buyers to price purchases in dollars, enforce dollar-denominated contracts, and deny Iran the flexibility to negotiate in alternative currencies. Every barrel of oil Iran sold had to pass through a financial system controlled or heavily influenced by the United States. If Iran attempted to circumvent these channels, it risked legal sanctions, asset freezes, and exclusion from global financial networks. In essence, the dollar acted as a digital chain, linking economic opportunity to compliance with U.S. policy. This approach demonstrates a crucial insight. Financial leverage does not require parity in military strength. The United States did not need to invade Iran to cripple its economy. It needed control over the system through which the world's money flowed. The dollar provided that control. By weaponizing a currency, the U.S. transformed routine commercial activity into an instrument of national security. Transactions became political statements, and banks and corporations became enforcers of geopolitical strategy. The strategy also relied on careful calibration. Too aggressive an approach could provoke unintended consequences, such as pushing Iran into closer alignment with rivals like the Soviet Union or China. Sanctions needed to be targeted, maintaining pressure on the regime while minimizing opportunities for external actors to exploit loopholes. At the same time, the threat of expansion like freezing foreign assets, restricting exports, or denying access to financial systems remained a potent deterrent, amplifying the psychological impact of the strategy. By the end of the first decade after the revolution, the dollar had become more than a medium of exchange for Iran, it was a strategic lever. Its weaponization forced Tehran to rethink its economic policies, international alignments, and domestic priorities. The United States had discovered that the real power of the dollar lay not in buying things, but in controlling the ability of others to buy, sell, and transact. The financial system itself became a battlefield, and Iran found itself locked in a high-stakes struggle where dollars were both prize and obstacle. Following the initial financial pressure, the United States escalated its use of the dollar as a strategic weapon, moving from indirect leverage to direct financial isolation. By the early 1980s, Washington had developed a sophisticated set of tools to tighten the grip on Iran's access to international markets. These measures were designed not only to limit Iran's ability to conduct business, but also to signal to the rest of the world the consequences of defying U.S. policy. One of the most potent tools was the freezing of Iranian assets abroad. The U.S. government could block Iranian bank accounts, government holdings, and investments in dollars anywhere in the world. Any foreign bank that attempted to assist Iran risked sanctions, fines, or loss of access to the U.S. financial system. This was not merely a symbolic act. It instantly immobilized hundreds of millions of dollars in government revenue, creating a liquidity crisis for Iran. Without access to these funds, Iran struggled to pay for imports, fund industrial projects, or service foreign debt. In effect, the United States turned the global financial system into a controlled space where every transaction required U.S. approval. This strategy of asset control also extended to commercial transactions. By threatening secondary sanctions, the U.S. ensured that even non-American banks and companies would comply. For instance, a European firm that sold technology to Iran in exchange for dollars risked being barred from doing business in the U.S. These indirect pressures multiplied the effectiveness of sanctions. Tehran's economic partners faced a stark choice: risk punitive measures or abandon Iran. The dollar became a force multiplier, creating a near-total embargo without requiring military intervention. Iran responded with attempts to circumvent the restrictions. The government explored alternative currencies, bartering agreements, and regional trade networks with countries like China, India, and the Soviet Union, but these measures were only partially successful. The dollar's dominance in global trade meant that most major transactions, especially oil sales, which generated the bulk of Iran's revenue, still required dollar clearance. The U.S. leveraged this reality, negotiating with allies and international institutions to tighten compliance. Iran could trade, but it could never fully escape the reach of Washington's financial oversight. The U.S. also used the dollar to manipulate Iran's borrowing capacity. International loans, foreign aid, and credit lines were increasingly contingent on adherence to U.S. policy. By threatening to restrict access to these critical financial resources, the United States ensured that Iran's economic decisions were constantly under scrutiny. The dollar, therefore, was no longer just currency. It was a measure of geopolitical obedience. Every transaction was a potential checkpoint for influence and control. The impact on Iran's domestic economy was profound. Inflation surged as shortages of imported goods became chronic. Industrial projects stalled due to the unavailability of critical equipment. Even basic commodities, such as medicine and food, faced bottlenecks. The government attempted to stabilize the situation through rationing and state intervention, but these measures were insufficient. Dollar-denominated imports had become the lifeblood of the economy, and cutting off access had the effect of a slow economic strangulation. In parallel, the U.S. took steps to influence Iran's global energy revenues. Oil, the country's primary source of foreign exchange, was tightly regulated through dollar-denominated contracts and pricing standards. Any buyer purchasing Iranian oil in a manner that circumvented the dollar system risked punitive measures or exclusion from U.S.-controlled financial networks. This strategy not only reduced Iran's immediate revenue but also created long-term uncertainty in foreign investment and trade. The financial squeeze sent a clear message. To operate internationally, Iran had to play by the rules set by Washington. Beyond economics, this strategy carried psychological weight. The perception of financial isolation weakened the government's credibility and exacerbated domestic discontent. Citizens experienced shortages and price spikes, which in turn strained political stability. In essence, the weaponization of the dollar created both external pressure and internal tension, a dual effect that magnified its strategic value. By systematically controlling access to dollars, freezing assets, and enforcing compliance through secondary sanctions, the United States had turned the global financial system into an instrument of statecraft. Tehran faced a stark reality. Survival depended not on military prowess or ideological rhetoric, but on navigating a dollar-dominated system designed to constrain its options. The United States' approach in this period illustrates a fundamental shift in power dynamics. Traditional military superiority was now complemented by financial leverage, and the dollar emerged as a strategic weapon capable of reshaping international relations. By combining sanctions, asset freezes, and trade controls, Washington created an environment in which Iran's economic autonomy was severely curtailed, setting the stage for a prolonged struggle defined by money credit and the ability to participate in the global financial system. By the late 1980s, the U.S. strategy had evolved beyond simply restricting Iran's economic options. The dollar had become a political instrument, shaping not only trade but also governance and internal stability within Iran. Washington understood that economic pressure could generate leverage over decision-making, influence alliances, and even affect the legitimacy of the regime itself. One key mechanism was the careful timing of sanctions and financial restrictions. The United States selectively allowed certain transactions while blocking others, creating uncertainty and forcing Iranian policymakers to constantly negotiate and adapt. For example, humanitarian exceptions were often allowed, but only through cumbersome procedures and with U.S. oversight. This maintained the narrative that Iran's economic woes were self-inflicted, while ensuring the population felt the impact. The dollar thus acted as both a carrot and a stick, a financial lever designed to reshape behavior without firing a single bullet. Iran tried to respond by diversifying its financial partnerships. It looked to regional allies, forming barter systems with countries like Iraq during periods of cooperation, as well as with Turkey and India. Tehran also experimented with alternative currencies and trade agreements to avoid dollar dependence. But the global financial architecture was overwhelmingly dollar-centric. Even nations willing to support Iran often demanded payments in dollars, ensuring that U.S. oversight persisted. The dollar's reach proved nearly omnipresent, limiting Iran's ability to circumvent pressure effectively. The psychological impact of this financial stranglehold was profound. Policymakers were forced to prioritize liquidity over long-term planning. Every industrial project, import contract, or international negotiation was filtered through the lens of financial access. Dollar scarcity meant that essential infrastructure projects stalled. Industrial capacity stagnated and military modernization slowed. The United States didn't need to invade Iran. Its control over currency access shaped the country's economic and political priorities from thousands of miles away. Internally, the pressure reverberated through Iranian society. Inflation and shortages affected ordinary citizens, creating tension and dissatisfaction. The government's attempts to stabilize the economy through price controls and subsidies often backfired, resulting in distorted markets and inefficiencies. Citizens became increasingly aware that the international financial system, dominated by the dollar, dictated their quality of life. In this sense, the weaponization of currency was both a macroeconomic and a social tool, influencing public sentiment and indirectly shaping political outcomes. Washington complemented these financial measures with diplomatic efforts. The U.S. worked to isolate Iran from international institutions, limiting access to credit, trade finance, and even participation in global forums. Banks worldwide feared violating U.S. sanctions and chose compliance over risk. This multilateral approach magnified the effect of the dollar as a tool of coercion. Iran found itself not just cut off from direct use transactions, but effectively excluded from the global financial system. Oil, Iran's primary source of foreign revenue, was a particularly critical arena. The U.S. leveraged the dollar to control access to global oil markets. Buyers who attempted to purchase oil outside the sanction framework risked U.S. penalties, freezing their own accounts, and exclusion from major financial hubs. This tactic drastically reduced Iran's bargaining power and revenue, further limiting its economic options. Every dollar that did flow into the country was carefully monitored, taxed, or delayed, creating a constant pressure on both government budgets and domestic stability. The weaponization of the dollar also created long-term strategic consequences. By demonstrating the power of financial sanctions, the United States sent a clear signal to other nations. Defiance could carry severe economic costs. The dollar's dominance meant that even geographically distant allies and rivals were subject to Washington's reach. Iran, in attempting to resist, had to develop clandestine financial networks and alternative trade mechanisms, often at higher costs and with lower efficiency. The economic overhead of these workarounds drained resources, slowed growth, and constrained long-term development. By the end of the 1980s, it was clear that the U.S. had transformed the dollar into a tool that extended far beyond commerce. It had become a strategic weapon capable of shaping policy, influencing internal governance, and redefining the balance of power. Iran's experience illustrated the broader implications of financial dominance. A country could control another's economy, constrain its political options, and influence its society, all without military intervention. Entering the 1990s, the U.S. strategy against Iran intensified, building on the framework of financial coercion already in place. The Gulf War had reshaped the Middle East, and Washington recognized that Iran's access to international finance remained the single most effective lever to influence the regime. The dollar, as the primary currency of global trade and reserves, became the fulcrum of an expanded sanctions regime. One major evolution was the introduction of secondary sanctions. These were designed to pressure not only Iranian entities but also foreign companies and banks that engaged with Iran. If a European bank facilitated a transaction for Iran, it risked being cut off from the US dollar system, effectively losing access to global markets. This created a chilling effect. Even countries nominally neutral toward Iran had to comply, ensuring the dollar's coercive power extended far beyond US borders. Iran's response involved innovative, though costly, financial maneuvers. The country expanded barter agreements, traded in alternative currencies like euros and Japanese yen, and even attempted clandestine gold shipments to bypass dollar controls. While these measures mitigated some pressure, they came with significant overhead. Every transaction became more complex, slower, and riskier. The cost of conducting business outside the dollar system meant higher prices, reduced profits, and limited investment opportunities. Internally, the sanctions reshaped Iran's economic priorities. Industries that relied on imports for raw materials, machinery, or technology faced chronic shortages. Civilian infrastructure projects slowed, and energy development was constrained by a lack of access to advanced equipment and international financing. Inflation continued to erode purchasing power, particularly for the middle class, while government subsidies strained public budgets. Dollar dominance dictated not only what Iran could buy, but also the pace of national development. The political dimension of these measures became increasingly apparent. US-led financial pressure weakened. Iran's negotiating position on regional issues, including relations with Iraq, Afghanistan, and Gulf states. By controlling the currency flows, Washington influenced Tehran's foreign policy indirectly. For instance, the dollar-centric sanctions made it difficult for Iran to fund proxies or maintain supply chains without exposing itself to additional financial penalties. Economic leverage, in this sense, became a tool of strategic deterrence. The weaponization of the dollar also forced Iran to develop alternative financial institutions. State-owned banks were repurposed to handle sanctioned transactions, and informal networks, including hawala systems and private intermediaries, became critical. These workarounds, however, increased vulnerability to fraud, corruption, and inefficiency. By forcing Iran into these higher-risk systems, the U.S. effectively amplified the economic cost of resistance while maintaining control over mainstream global commerce. During this period, the U.S. also linked the sanctions to broader diplomatic objectives. Cooperation on non-proliferation, nuclear inspections, and regional security became conditional on Iran's compliance with dollar-centric financial norms. Access to international loans, trade agreements, and oil markets was contingent on adherence to U.S. expectations. The interplay of finance and diplomacy transformed the dollar from a medium of exchange into a tool of policy enforcement. By the mid-1990s, Iran's economy had adapted but remained constrained. GDP growth was modest, industrial output lagged, and foreign investment was minimal. The government became increasingly focused on maintaining internal stability, controlling inflation, and preserving access to critical imports, rather than pursuing ambitious modernization projects. Each policy decision was filtered through the reality of dollar dominance, illustrating how currency control could shape not just markets, but the political agenda of a nation. The global message of this period was clear. Dollar dominance could be leveraged to enforce compliance, shape alliances, and contain regional ambitions. Iran's experience underscored the systemic advantages enjoyed by the United States. As long as the world relied on the dollar, Washington could exert influence far beyond its borders. The cumulative effect was a form of economic containment restraining Iran's growth, limiting its strategic options, and reshaping internal priorities without a single U.S. soldier crossing its border. As the new millennium approached, the U.S. strategy against Iran evolved into a long-term economic containment plan. The dollar's supremacy in global trade had matured into a structural advantage. Iran could no longer rely on conventional banking or international investment to fuel its economic ambitions. Every sector from energy and manufacturing to agriculture and technology felt the ripple effects of being isolated from the dollar system. The most visible consequence was in Iran's energy sector. Despite possessing the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves, Iran struggled to sell crude internationally on favorable terms. Foreign oil companies avoided projects in Iran, fearing secondary sanctions that could jeopardize their access to U.S. dollars in Western markets. Deals that were previously profitable became untenable, forcing Tehran to seek buyers willing to trade in alternative currencies or accept barter agreements. The complexity of these arrangements reduced efficiency and profitability, making Iran's most valuable resource less productive. Sanctions also severely limited Iran's access to international financing. Banks and investors around the world, wary of losing their ability to transact in dollars, avoided lending to Iranian institutions. This choked off credit for infrastructure projects, industrial expansion, and even basic import needs. Attempting to fund projects through domestic capital proved inadequate. Iran had the resources, the ambition, and the human capital, but the mechanisms of the global economy were increasingly closed to them. The dollar effectively acted as a gatekeeper. Iran's leadership recognized that survival required creative financial strategies. The government began to emphasize self-sufficiency, focusing on domestic production and import substitution programs. Local industries, particularly in agriculture, mining, and manufacturing, were encouraged to produce what was previously imported. While these policies helped reduce dependency on dollar-denominated trade, they were costly and slow to bear fruit. Productivity gains were modest, and technological progress lagged because Iran could not easily access Western equipment or software. The political consequences were profound. The Iranian regime, while maintaining strict control over domestic dissent, faced a public increasingly frustrated by rising prices, limited job opportunities, and economic stagnation. Dollar-based sanctions created social pressure, as citizens struggled with inflation and shortages. These economic constraints shaped not only internal politics, but also Iran's foreign policy, forcing Tehran to make concessions in regional conflicts and nuclear negotiations. Economic coercion through the dollar became a silent but powerful form of diplomacy. The dollar's influence extended beyond Iran's borders. Neighboring countries, international investors, and even multinational corporations were all acutely aware of the consequences of engaging with Tehran. U.S. secondary sanctions effectively globalized the reach of the dollar. Iran's exclusion from mainstream financial channels was not merely a bilateral issue. It reshaped the region's economic network. Middle Eastern banks, trade intermediaries, and energy companies all recalibrated their strategies to avoid jeopardizing their dollar access. By the early 2000s, the cumulative effect was clear. Iran had become a partially isolated economy, capable of maintaining sovereignty but limited in growth potential. The dollar had emerged not just as a currency but as a geopolitical weapon. Washington's ability to project power without deploying troops, controlling global finance to influence another country's economy and policy, demonstrated an unprecedented form of leverage. Even today, the legacy of dollar weaponization against Iran continues to influence global finance. The Iranian experience serves as a case study for nations seeking alternatives to the U.S. financial system. Efforts to establish trade in euros, yuan, or other currencies reflect a recognition that dependence on the dollar can be exploited as a strategic tool. Yet, the systemic inertia of dollar dominance remains formidable, and Iran's economic trajectory illustrates both the potential and limits of resisting it. The story of the dollar and Iran is a lesson in the power of financial architecture. Unlike conventional warfare, which destroys physical assets, this strategy undermines economic vitality, influences political decision-making, and reshapes societal priorities, all without firing a shot. For Iran, The cost of resisting dollar control has been decades of constrained growth, strategic recalibration, and a constant balancing act between survival and ambition. In essence, the US weaponized the dollar as a tool of sustained pressure. It forced Iran to confront the realities of modern global finance, transforming a simple medium of exchange into a means of strategic dominance. The ripple effects, economic, political, and social, illustrate the profound consequences of a currency that functions as both money and weapon.